and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. And today's topic is what I'm titling Creating Mexican Americans, or Hyphenated Americans. Now, as always, take a moment, hit pause on this video, jot down the lecture outline to the right, and pay particular attention to those key terms at the left. Make sure you can identify the who, what, where, when, why, be able to connect them to each other and their larger historical significance. You got it? Let's get started. So welcome back. We last left off with the Mexican-American War, aka the War of Manifest Destiny, Part 1. While the results of the war were disastrous for the Mexican nation, losing nearly half their territory, the reality is the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo did not seem so bad for the Mexicans themselves, the nearly 100,000 who were living in the newly acquired U.S. territory. Per the treaty, they were guaranteed citizenship and they would be guaranteed to keep their land, i.e., they were declaring Mexicans to be white, just like other European whites. However, this was, of course, all on paper. It did not play out so well on the ground. In addition, the floodgates to Anglo expansion led Anglos to rush out into these new areas with no intention of sharing equality with the newly minted Americans. Instead, this interaction created a new ethno-racial group in the United States, the Mexican American, who I'm generally going to refer to as Mexicano, because in general, I don't want to have to deal with whether that specific person was a citizenship at that point or not. I'm going to use the generalized term Mexicano. And it will be generally interchangeable unless I need to specifically denote Mexican American or Mexican. Let's start, though, with the gold rush. We mentioned that at the end of the last lecture. Let's start with that. So in 1849, in perhaps the largest let's rub salt in the wound in history, the year after the Mexican-American War ends in 1849, just 1 year after it ends, gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill in California, setting off what's called the gold rush. And the more common term that we all familiar with today, 49ers. Of course, the football team from San Francisco was named that because they are known as 49ers because in the year 1849, they all began to rush to California. This led thousands of get-rich-quick prospectors who began to rush to the Pacific coast in hope of finding easy fortunes. However, this quick expansion would lead to conflict, a mixing of ethno-racial groups, and quickly lead whites to find ways to create new ways to steal land that was guaranteed by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So this racial mixing, right, takes place. The promise of the get-rich-quick was very alluring to everyone, and it brought together people from all over the world, hundreds and thousands of them. You have to realize it wasn't just Native Americans, Anglo-Americans, and Mexican Americans. There were Chinese, there were Japanese, there were African Americans, there were French people, there were Chileans, and among others. And they all came together in the Miwok Indian hunting and gathering grounds. So first of all, they're invading Indian territory once again. But for a very brief time, other than the Native Americans, there was actually a great deal of ethno-racial cooperation. In other words, everyone did kind of get along for a while. And here's the thing. The Anglo-US miners, they learned how to mine by watching the Mexicans, the Chileans, and the Californios. Now, Californios, make note, I know we talked about this before, but make note, Californios are those who are now Mexican Americans who are living in California, right? So the Californios are your Mexican Americans. You also have Mexican immigrants coming up from Mexico. You have Chileans And they're all coming together. They're the ones who actually teach U.S. Anglos how to mine. And for a short time, there's a great deal of cooperation. But pretty soon, all the easy gold that you get by panhandling is gone. And things turn to tremendous animosity. And so after Anglos learned the skill to mining deep in the earth from the Mexicans, Chileans, and Californios, Anglos began to invent ways to exclude Mexicanos from mining in California. And it kind of broke it down into three major ways or categories. Number one, individual incidents of harassment. So individual harassments. So they're going to use individual acts of harassment to get rid of so-called Mexicans. There's laws of exclusion. Talk about those in a minute. And then there's the foreign miners tax. So we have these individual incidents of harassment. We have the laws of exclusion and then the foreign miners tax. So here's the situation now. So in 1846, leading up to the Mexican-American War, there were about 14,000 non-Native American residents in California. So prior to the Mexican-American War, 1846, you have a substantial Native American population, Indian population. But then, in addition, there are about 14,000 non-Native American inhabitants or residents. Of the 14,000, about 11,500 were of Spanish and or Mexican descent. So by and large, prior to the Mexican-American War, the vast majority, again, 11,500 out of 14,000, were either of Mexican or Spanish descent, so Spanish speakers. By 1850, just 2 years after the war ends, the Spanish-speaking California population is now only 15% of the non-Indian population. This just shows you how many whites are flooding into that territory, Anglos from the United States. By 1870, just 20 years later, Spanish-speaking residents are now down to 4%. And the thing is, even that small 4% group were not unified because there was diversity within that 4% group. Because among that 4% group, there were wealthy landowners, and then there were the more everyday average Spanish speakers. And those who were the rich elite of those Spanish-speaking descent they embraced what was called the Don system, or the Don system, if you want to say it in more anglicized form. The Don system are these wealthy, landowning, Spanish-speaking elites who, like their Anglo counterparts, exploited laborers for their own benefit. Now, what they would often do, and you kind of liken them to a modern-day drug cartel, they would stay in power both politically and economically by giving gifts to appease the poorer masses. So, hey, it's wintertime coming. Here's a few logs for your fire. Or they'll give a gift at the wedding of a poor person. And by doing so, they're able to have just enough goodwill that they are allowed to remain in power. But that system is now being threatened as Anglos come in from the United States, and California is going to become a state. And so now these Dons are faced with a crisis. Should they try to be more like the Anglos coming in, or should they side with their Spanish-speaking brethren? And the result is the vast majority of the time, these Dons, these California elites, they would often pit themselves against their Mexicano brethren because they ultimately fear losing their wealth and privilege and power. And they fear that if they do side with the Mexicano brethren, they're going to be lumped together with the poorer people. And so let me give you an example of this. In 1849, 48 delegates get together to draft a state constitution for the state of California. 8 of the 48 were of Spanish-speaking descent. They were Californios. Now, 8 out of 48 is not a huge percentage, but 8 out of 48 is a substantial voting bloc. But when it came time to negotiate what they want in the state constitution, they voted for their own self-interests rather than the masses of Mexicanos in the region, many of whom these Californio elites referred to as cholos, a pejorative derogatory term for low-caste Mexicanos. And so there was a disconnect, a caste system, a racial caste system, for lack of a better term, between the Californio elites, the Dons, and the average everyday Spanish speakers that they refer to as cholos. And they rationalize this by saying, well, we're Californio elites. We have lighter skin. These cholos have darker skins, and thus they are inferior. But in doing so, these Californio elites begin to vote for their own self-interests of retaining their own land and power. And this includes not voting or voting against the idea of separating California into 2 states, a northern and southern California, which, if you think about it, makes a lot of sense. And in doing so, the plan was that the northern California would belong to Anglos. Southern California would be left to be run by Mexicanos. Again, this makes a lot of sense. But these Californios, even though they would keep their power in the South, they rationalized that they would actually get more revenue long-term by taxing the mines of Northern California compared to the lands of the South, which they already owned. And so in a play that they were in their own minds assuming they would be accepted as equal, in power with the Anglos, they shot themselves in the foot, so to speak, because they could have kept their power in the South. But because they said, well, no, the mines are in the north, in San Francisco area, that'll bring in more land tax revenue to us if we're still in power, that they voted against giving Mexicanos power in the South. Or they might have to share it with the poorer class of the cholos. This is a huge mistake on their part. So even though these Californios will secure voting rights for non-whites, i.e. Mexicanos, they will succeed in getting laws printed both in English and Spanish, which California is one of the only states to do this. These were minor victories compared with the fact that Mexicanos would now be treated as second-class citizens in their own homes. And despite their attempt to shape politics and laws to benefit them, that drafting of the state constitution is really the last time they will have any input on political affairs of the state. After this, they will be ousted. The imposition of a new state government in California will reverse the fortunes of the elite Californios, who begin to slowly lose their power, their authority, and their land. And slowly, and it's not overnight, this is slowly, they will begin to be lumped together with the lower classes, those cholos that they so had disdain for. Because most Anglos do not distinguish between light and dark skin. All they see is Spanish speaking, that they're not white like them. And so I mentioned those 3 categories earlier: individual harassment, laws of exclusion, and the foreign miners tax, right? Let's talk about these, how they played out in practice. For example, in San Francisco, local citizens became so impatient with either the inability or unwillingness of local police officers to enforce the law that they formed what they called a vigilance committee in 1851. Now, it's called a vigilance committee because you're having vigilance in enforcing laws. In reality, it's a vigilante committee. They're committing acts of vigilantism. So by the time the committee disbands, so this is formed in spring of 1851, by the time it disbands at the end of September, the Vigilance Committee has hanged 4 men, handed 15 people over to the police for trial, and then either whipped or deported 29 more. I'm going to repeat that. This Vigilance Committee, extrajudicial, outside the law, private citizens, took the law into their own hands, hanged 4 men, handed 15 over to the police for trials, and whipped or deported 29 more. And the San Francisco experiment or experience would inspire these vigilance committees in other towns and mining camps. Now, there were some reforms that pushed back against this, but ultimately the city's marshal and one of the newspaper editors were shot and gunned down in 1856. And a second vigilance committee was formed in San Francisco. This time they seized the guns, the armaments, from the local state militia. These are radical people who were taking the law in their own hands. And so they get what they want in 1851, like there are reforms passed. But as new pressures come, as there are some things they don't like, they form a second committee. This time they get more guns. Try to enforce the law by their own hand rather than rely on the justice system. Again, this is vigilantism. They would also impose what's called the foreign miners tax. And so white miners, Anglo miners in California, believed that foreigners were stealing the gold from California and then exporting it to benefit of other nations. Sound familiar? Stealing jobs, right? Stealing gold this time. In fact, Sacramento politician G.B. Tingley, he warned that this practice amounted to a foreign invasion of Mexicans who are, quote unquote, devoid of intelligence. So here you have a politician from Sacramento, G.B. Tingley, who argues that foreigners, Mexicans, are stealing gold from California. And what this represents is a foreign invasion by Mexicans. In response, Thomas Jefferson Green, who was a Texas white supremacist who hated Mexicans, proposed a bill that was called the Foreign Miners License Tax, or the Foreign Miners Tax. And so in 1850, the California legislature adopted this Foreign Miners License Tax that was aimed at greasers, who in their minds are basically anyone with darker skin that spoke Spanish. And they referred to basically all Latin Americans as greasers by this point. And this foreign miners tax charged these so-called greasers $20 a month. That's expensive in 1850. And of course, when Latin American miners, again, whether you're from Mexico, whether you're from Chile, whether you're from Central America, it was irrelevant. Anyone who was Latin American was required to pay this tax, or anyone Chinese for that matter as well. But when Latin American miners refused to pay the impossibly high tax, again, $20 a month, this gave a pretext for white miners to drive them out of the rich mining areas. So yeah, this was a foreign miner tax. So in theory, might have sounded okay. Well, okay, you're not a resident, you're not a citizen, you're paying an extra tax. Okay, you might get some people to agree it's not a bad thing. But the reality is no one could afford that. And this was done as a pretext, as a way to deport people they didn't like. I mean, and think about it. Do you really think that when an Anglo minor looks at the person next to him and sees that they speak Spanish or have darker skin, do they really know their citizenship status? And the answer is no. They just assume they're foreign and thus want to push them out. And then there's the laws of exclusion and the issue of land grants. You see, in the years leading up to the Mexican-American War, remember, Mexico is still a pretty new country. And there were a lot of informal land grants given that were made even more tenuous with the legal claims regarding the gold rush. And so in 1851, the US Congress passed what was called the California Land Act. And this is the US government, US Congress, passed a law called the California Land Act in 1851 that encouraged squatters. So basically, a squatter is someone who just lives on the land free of charge, doesn't negotiate with the landowner, just says, I'm living here now. And this California Land Act encouraged squatters to challenge all Spanish Mexican land grants. So remember, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo guaranteed that Mexicans would keep their property, right? In 1851, just 3 years after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, excuse me, the US government passed the California Land Act that said, no, here's what you should do. If you're an Anglo person moving to California, go and live on that person's land. If you want it, go live on it. And then you'll become a squatter. Then take the landowner to court and challenge their legal claim to that land. Because what the Land Act, the California Land Act said was, not the squatter, but the landowner himself would have the burden of proof to prove that they are the legal owner of that land. And you have to understand, sometimes this is pre-internet databases. This is pre-major contracts stored in a place somewhere with housing deeds. These are often informal. They give down by generations. They marry into other families and expand their land holdings. So there's not always readily paper trail for every small transaction. It was that way in the United States. Same for Mexico. And don't forget, Mexico had just changed hands within the last 20 years from being Spain. Well, 30 years in this case. And so in 1851, they passed this law and said, hey, squatters, you go live on the land and you challenge them. It's on their responsibility to prove that you shouldn't be there, that they actually own the land. This is a clear violation of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. But Anglos believed they had a special privilege by, in their words, right of conquest. Mexicans, or in this case, Mexicanos, were conquered foes. And that it was, in their words, undemocratic that these 200 Mexican foreign families owned some 14 million acres of land. So they're looking at the situation saying, these 200 so-called Mexican families, these foreigners, which again, not really foreigners, they're Mexican Americans by law. They're white by law. But it's unfair that these 200 families own 14 million acres of land. So what you should do is go live on their land as a squatter, challenge their legal claim to the land in court, and make them have to deal with burden of proof. But here's the real rub of this. If a squatter takes the California to court, challenging their title, and let's assume for a minute that California was able to produce the document, that Anglo squatter was able to keep appealing the decision as many as 6 times, all the way up to the Supreme Court. Not only did this delay allow the squatter to stay on that land for years, they're trespassing, but they have to stay there. It was the California landowner, the wealthy Mexican American, who bore the burden of producing, number one, the legal titles, and paying the exorbitant legal fees. And they're faced with biased judges and juries who were easily bribed. And even if they were successful, this entire arduous process often bankrupted the once wealthy, powerful landowners. Taking all these things together, the individual acts of violence, the vigilance committees, the foreign miners tax, the laws of exclusion, these things paint all Mexicanos as outsiders. Take the miners tax. Again, when whites on the ground see a darker skinned Spanish speaker next to them, they don't know if they pay the tax or not. And they don't care. All they see them as is as foreign, as different. They view them as stealing their land because they're trying to remake California into their image, a white space. This pushed Mexicanos, rich or otherwise, to the outside of society. They became cooks and cleaners, performing the tasks that Anglos felt were beneath them. And thus, as wealthy Anglos began to purchase land and start large mine operations, they began to hire the Mexicanos, as well as Chinese, as cheap, disposable laborers. Now, of course, when people cannot earn a living within a system, or when they're degraded, they begin to strike or lash out. Now, the rebellion can take many forms. Some is organized resistance, but often in the early days of California, it was the form of bandit activity, often vigilantism, or in some respects, you could call it an anti-hero. Now, U.S. popular culture is littered with these types of bandits, these anti-heroes, who take justice into their own hands after seeing what they believe is injustice. And again, this is something we should not be surprised about, right? If a person sees a lot of injustice, they feel the justice system is not helping them or doing, well, justice. They take the law into their own hands. They become known as vigilantes sometimes, or anti-heroes. And even modern day, our pop culture is littered with them. Venom, technically a bad guy. Deadpool, kills people. Even Batman. Batman saw his parents murdered, sees crime in the city. The police can't do the job. He takes over. Vigilantism. Or more historic anti-heroes. People like Robin Hood, steals from the rich and gives to the poor. And of course, the very famous Zorro. I mean, dozens of movies made about Zorro. The best of which, in my opinion at least, are the ones with Antonio Banderas. Especially the first one. And so Mexicanos themselves, despite this displacement as racialized others, they often respond in what would be called a bandido. Take the very infamous Joaquin Marietta. At least 4 movies have been made about this man. You see, rumors begin swirling throughout Gold Country about a swashbuckling Mexican bandit named Joaquin Marietta, who was striking back against American injustices. Now, there's a lot of fact and fiction here, but let's try to stay with the main narrative. Joaquin Marietta was from Sonora, Mexico. Now, depending on your viewpoint, he was either a ruthless bandit or he was a much wronged man who was defying the assaults and greed of Anglo-Americans. So many tall tales have grown up around Marietta that it's really hard to disentangle the fabulous from the factual. There seems, however, to be a consensus that Joaquin Marietta was driven by Anglos from his rich mining claim. So he had land, he had a mining claim, and Anglos came and removed him. And then after that, in rapid succession, he lost his land. His wife was gang raped. His half-brother was lynched, and Joaquin Marietta himself was horsewhipped. Now, as one historian, Susan Johnson, put it, quote, all agree that by 1853, one or more men named Joaquin and his or their comrades, again, we're not sure if it was one man or multiple men, they were dashing in and out of the Sierra foothills on fast horses, stealing gold dust and livestock, and occasionally killing people, unquote. Marietta's defenders. So if you're a person who wanted to defend Marietta, they insist he only took what he needed to survive, and that it was other gangs who carried out the robberies, seemingly in his name, and that Marietta only killed those men who had gang raped his wife and killed his brother. But Anglos intended to view him in a very dichotomous way. In many ways, they viewed him as brave, but an amoral ruffian. They both admired and feared him. As Susan Johnson argued, for Anglo men, Joaquin was like their own worst self, dark, sensual, impulsive, and out of control. Now, in 1853, the California legislature offered a huge reward, and a Texan by the name of Harry Love produced the head of someone he insisted was Marietta. The head was preserved in alcohol in a large jar and exhibited to the public for years. Now, whether he actually ever really existed or was just an urban legend, we're not fully sure. We think he was a real person. But either way, he was an anti-hero. He was celebrated as a hero by so many Latin Americans who were enraged by the oppressive American policies. How about another example? Tubercio Vasquez. He was born a wealthy, respected, educated man in Monterrey in 1835. But in 1852, he went to a party, a fiesta, and was involved in the shooting of a constable, and he would flee into the hills. When asked why he did this, he responded saying, quote, my career as a bandit, as a bandido, grew out of the circumstances by which I was surrounded as I grew into manhood. I was in the habit of attending balls and parties given by the native Californians, the Mexicans, in which the Americans, then becoming more numerous, would force themselves and shove the native-born men aside, monopolizing the dances and the women. A spirit of hatred and revenge took possession of me. I had numerous fights in defense of what I believed to be my rights and those of my countrymen. I believe that we were unjustly and wrongfully deprived of the social rights which belonged us. This is a man who grew up in a life of luxury. But when faced with losing everything at the hands of Anglo-Americans coming in, stealing land, stealing the women, stealing their lives, he turned to banditry. In the fall of 1871, he and his men would rob the Visalia estate, causing his reputation as a desperado to grow. Soon, he began to be blamed for crimes he had not even committed, which only increased the amount of reward in the manhunt. In August of 1873, he and his men robbed Snyder's store at Tres Pinos of $1,200. Again, that's a large sum of money in 1850s, 1870s. Over the next year, the sheriff quickened the chase, covering 2,100 miles in 61 days, before surrounding the ranch of George Allen and finally capturing Tubercio Vasquez. Big surprise, he was found guilty by an all-Anglo jury and hanged. So how do we sum up these anti-heroes, these bandidos? Well, I'm going to leave you the words of George Beers. George Beers is a reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle. You see that it's a lengthy quote, but I think it's important to understand. He explains in this article that Vasquez turned to the life of a bandito because of the bitter animosity then existing, and which still exists, he says, between the white settlers and the Mexican portion of the population. This feeling was greatly intensified by the rough, brutal conduct of the worst class of American settlers, who never missed an opportunity to openly exhibit their contempt for native Californian or Mexican population, designating them as the quote unquote damned greasers, treating them like dogs. Add to this the fact these helpless people were cheated out of their land and possession by every subterfuge. In many instances, their property being actually wrested from them by force and having their women debauched whenever practical. And we can understand very clearly some of the causes which gave Joaquin and Vasquez and others of their stripe. In other words, this is a white man, Anglo, who says these guys did not turn to banditry because they wanted to. They turned to it out of necessity, out of injustice done to them by the worst of American ideals, the worst of Americans coming in and stealing their land, raping their women. And I think this was just California. This will be a pattern repeated throughout the Southwest in places like Arizona and New Mexico, where we are going next. But I will stop here for now. We will pick up with how life was in New Mexico in the 1850s post Mexican-American War next time. So until then, take care and bye-bye.